My name is Sam Bridges. For the past 6 months, I had been speaking to a voice on the phone that called me Grandpa and begged for help. I gave him nearly all of my savings, believing I was saving my grandson. But yesterday, when I heard the same familiar phrase through the receiver, I turned around and saw my real grandson standing in the doorway of my room. He had heard everything, and in his eyes I saw no surprise, no sympathy. I saw a verdict, and in that moment I realized the scammer had been stealing my money, but my grandson had been stealing my soul. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Samuel Bridges, though no one has called me anything but Sam in 50 years. I am 78 years old, and my world has contracted to the quiet, predictable confines of this house in the suburbs of Chicago. I spent 40 years of my life as an audit engineer for the phone company, a job that suited my temperament perfectly. I didn't build systems, I interrogated them. I looked for weaknesses, for illogical connections, for the single tiny flaw that could bring the entire structure down. My life, since my wife Eleanor passed, has been a system of its own, a series of orderly routines designed to keep the chaos of grief at bay. That morning began like all the others. I was at my desk in the small room I still called my study. The sun, weak and autumnal, streamed through the clean window, illuminating the desk where I conducted the business of my solitary life. Before me, my accounts ledger lay open. It was a thick, leather-bound volume with crisp graph paper pages, a relic from an age before spreadsheets. With a fountain pen filled with black ink, I was reconciling my monthly bank statement. Every transaction, from the electric bill to the grocery receipt, was entered by hand in neat, block-printed numbers. The process was a comfort, a familiar ritual of order. I was auditing my own life, ensuring every penny was accounted for, that the system was in balance. To my left, a cup of black tea grew cool. My desk was an island of precision. Pens and pencils rested in a ceramic holder aligned by length. A stack of bills to be paid was squared off perfectly, weighted down by a smooth piece of granite I'd picked up on a trip with Eleanor. Everything had its place. Once the ledger was balanced to the cent, I leaned back, my chair groaning softly. My eyes drifted to the wall opposite my desk. It was dominated by a large, detailed map of the world, a beautiful old thing from the days when borders were simpler. The map was peppered with dozens of small, colorful pins, each one a memory. A red pin for Paris, where Eleanor had cried seeing the Eiffel Tower for the first time. A blue pin for the Grand Canyon, where we had stood in silent awe as the sun set. A yellow pin for a small, forgotten town in Maine, where we'd eaten the best lobster of our lives. We had a plan to add so many more. A green one for Ireland, a white one for the coast of Greece. The pins were still there, waiting in a small wooden box on the desk, a collection of unfulfilled futures. My gaze lingered on the map for a long time, tracing the roots of our shared past. The house was full of her absence, a silence that had its own weight and texture. My eyes fell from the map to the single photograph I kept on my desk. It was of my grandson, Leo. The picture was 5 years old, taken at his college graduation. He stood in his cap and gown, a diploma clutched in one hand, a wide, confident smile on his face. He had his father's eyes. My son, gone so young. All I had left of him was this boy, this young man now making his way in the world. I worried about him. We didn't talk as often as I would have liked. He was busy with his job, his life, a world of digital noise and relentless speed that felt very far from my quiet, analog existence. But my love for him was a solid, undeniable thing, the one pin I was still trying to place on the map of my present. I picked up the photo, my thumb brushing away a speck of dust from the glass. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times. its deep, familiar tones marking the transition to the next phase of my daily routine. I put the photograph back in its precise spot, capped my fountain pen, and closed the heavy ledger. I took my cold tea to the kitchen and rinsed the cup, placing it upside down on a drying rack, exactly parallel to the glass from my breakfast. The house was quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant whine of a neighbor's lawnmower. I walked through the living room, my hand trailing over the back of Eleanor's armchair, its floral pattern faded from years of sunlight. I adjusted a picture frame on the wall that was hanging a fraction of a degree crooked. I saw the world in systems, in lines and angles, and a crooked picture frame was an error that required correction. It was as I stood in the dead center of the living room, a room built for a family, now occupied only by me, that the telephone rang. Its sharp, shrill ring was a sudden intrusion into the placid silence, a disruption to the morning's quiet rhythm. I smiled. It was Tuesday. Leo sometimes called on Tuesdays during his lunch break. I walked to the phone on the small table in the hallway, my step a little lighter, a warmth spreading through my chest at the prospect of hearing his voice. I picked up the receiver on the third ring. I brought it to my ear, my familiar cheerful greeting already formed on my lips. But I never said it. There was no one there. There was only silence. It wasn't the dead, empty silence of a disconnected line. It was a hollow, listening silence, the kind where you can feel the presence of someone on the other end, holding their breath, an electric hum on the line, nothing more. Then, after a long, drawn-out moment, there was a sharp, definitive click as the connection was severed. The dial tone began its monotonous drone. I stood there for a long time, holding the receiver, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I slowly placed it back in its cradle. I looked at the small digital screen of the caller ID. It displayed 2 words, unknown number. It was nothing, a wrong number, a faulty auto-dialer from some telemarketing firm. There were a dozen logical explanations, and my mind, the auditor, sifted through them, seeking the most plausible. And yet, I could not shake the feeling of profound unease. It was the quality of the silence, the feeling of being listened to. It was an error in the system, an anomaly that did not fit the pattern of my day. I walked back to my study and sat down at my desk, my perfectly ordered world feeling suddenly, almost imperceptibly, less secure. I looked at the photograph of my smiling grandson, and for the first time, the warmth I felt was tinged with a faint, cold flicker of anxiety. The calm of the day had been broken. The shrill, violent ring of the telephone tore me from the depths of a dreamless sleep. It was 2:13 a.m. I knew this because the red digital numbers of my bedside clock were the first thing I saw, a stark, angry slash of light in the profound darkness of the room. A phone call at this hour was never good news. It was the harbinger of bad tidings, the official announcement of a tragedy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. My mind, still thick with sleep, scrambled for purchase, immediately cycling through a terrible litany of possibilities. A hospital, the police, a call about Leo. I fumbled for the lamp, my hand knocking over a glass of water, the sound of it hitting the floor a distant, unimportant crash. The phone continued its merciless screaming. I finally found the switch and a soft yellow light filled the room, chasing the worst of the shadows away. I took a deep, shuddering breath and picked up the receiver, my hand slick with a sudden cold sweat. The voice on the other end was a wreck. It was a young man's voice, choked with sobs and thick with panic, the words tumbling over one another in a frantic rush. The connection was terrible, full of static and a strange, hollow echo, as if he were calling from the bottom of a well. Through the noise and the crying, I could make out a few terrible words. It was my grandson, Leo. Or it sounded like him. It sounded like the ghost of him, put through some terrible filter of pain and fear. He was in trouble, he said. Deep trouble. The story came out in jagged, desperate pieces. He had been in a car accident. He was okay, just shaken up. But he was in another city, hours away. He was at a police station. The details were a confusing blur of a minor fender bender, a friend who had been drinking, and a misunderstanding with the authorities. My analytical mind, the auditor, tried to come online. It tried to ask the logical questions. What city? Who was the friend? Why did the connection sound so strange? But for every question my reason tried to form, the voice on the phone had an emotional countermeasure. He sobbed my name. He spoke of his shame, of how he had let me and the memory of his grandmother down. He mentioned how disappointed his father would have been in him, a calculated, devastating blow that struck me right in the heart. The voice was a master of psychological warfare. It was exploiting the single greatest vulnerability in my entire system, my love for my grandson. The core of the crisis was money. He needed it for a lawyer, a retainer to get him out of this mess before it became a permanent mark on his record. The amount was substantial, enough to make me pause, but not so large as to be impossible. It was a carefully chosen number, designed to be the absolute maximum a person like me could access in an emergency without raising red flags. And then came the most crucial instruction, the one that should have been the loudest alarm bell of all. I was not to tell anyone, not his mother, not any of my friends. He was too ashamed. He sobbed. It would only make things worse. He begged me to keep it between us, a desperate plea for my trust and my discretion. It was a brilliant, cruel tactic, a way to isolate me, to cut me off from any external voice of reason that might have talked me down from the ledge of my own fear. I stood there in the cold silence of my bedroom, the phone pressed hard against my ear, the voice of my grandson's ghost begging me to save him. The engineer in me was screaming that the data was corrupt, that the system was showing a critical error. The logic was flawed. The story had holes. But the grandfather in me was screaming louder. What if I was wrong? What if this was real and I hesitated? What if, because of my doubt, my grandson's future was ruined? The risk of being wrong was too great. The potential consequences too catastrophic to contemplate. The fear for him, a visceral protective instinct, overrode everything else. I was no longer an auditor assessing a system. I was a grandfather, and my boy was in trouble. The call ended with a hurried recitation of account numbers and wiring instructions for a supposed public defender's trust account. The voice on the phone gave me a final, tearful thank you before the line went dead, leaving me in a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. I did not go back to bed. Sleep was an impossibility. I paced the length of the dark house, from the living room to the kitchen and back again, my mind a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. I stopped in my study and looked at the smiling, confident face of Leo in the photograph on my desk. I was protecting that smile. I was preserving that future. Any doubt I had was a betrayal of that boy. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the windows, my decision was made. I dressed with a sense of grim purpose and drove to the bank, arriving a full 10 minutes before it opened. I sat in my truck in the empty parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart a dull, heavy ache in my chest. When the doors finally opened, I walked inside. I felt the curious, slightly concerned gaze of the young teller as I, a man who normally only dealt in small checks and cash withdrawals, requested the paperwork for a large, urgent wire transfer. As I filled out the forms, my hand was trembling, but my resolve was firm. I paused for a single fleeting moment, the pen hovering over the signature line. The auditor, in his final dying act of protest, screamed that I should make one more call, that I should verify, that I should trust the process. But the grandfather pushed him aside. I signed my name. I pushed the form across the counter. I watched the teller type the information into her computer. With a few quiet clicks, the money, a significant portion of my life's savings, was gone. I walked out of the bank and into the bright, indifferent morning sun, feeling not the relief of a hero, but the profound, hollowed-out exhaustion of a man who had just been completely and utterly compromised. The calls did not stop. They became a regular feature of my life, a recurring illness that would flare up without warning. Sometimes a week would pass in blessed silence, a quiet that allowed a fragile scab of normalcy to form over the wound of my anxiety. I would start to believe it was over, that the phantom Leo had gotten what he wanted and moved on. But then, the phone would ring, always from an unknown number, and the scab would be ripped away. The stories grew more elaborate, more desperate. The lawyer needed more money for an expert witness. The car, it turned out, required a special payment to the impound lot to avoid being auctioned. Each new crisis was a fresh assault, each call a carefully crafted performance of panic and despair, designed to keep me in a state of perpetual fear for my grandson's future. My savings, the quiet accumulation of a lifetime of careful planning, dwindled with each wire transfer. I would watch the numbers on my online bank statement shrink, a digital representation of my life's work bleeding away into the ether. I tried to speak to the real Leo about it. During our infrequent phone calls, I would attempt to breach the subject, my voice hesitant. I would mention the strange, upsetting calls I'd been getting, hinting at their content. His reaction was always the same, a dismissive, slightly impatient sigh. He would tell me it was just spam, that I needed to be more careful, that I shouldn't answer calls from numbers I didn't recognize. His advice was a blanket of condescension that offered no warmth, no real concern. He treated my growing terror as a symptom of my age, a silly, senile fixation. Each conversation left me feeling more isolated, more foolish, and more convinced that the only person I could rely on to help the Leo in trouble was me. The moment it all broke happened on a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside was a flat, unforgiving gray, threatening a rain that never came. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, the familiar ritual a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. The phone rang. I saw the words "unknown number" on the caller ID, and my stomach twisted into a familiar cold knot. I picked it up, and the voice was there, the phantom Leo, already in mid-panic. This time, the story was about a lost wallet, a missed flight, and an urgent need for money to buy a new ticket home. I was pacing the length of the kitchen, the phone cord stretched taut, my back to the hallway. I was lost in the drama, my mind racing, trying to process the logistics of this new demand, my heart aching with a mixture of pity and a growing, weary frustration. I did not hear the front door open. I did not hear the soft footfalls in the hallway. I was so consumed by the voice in my ear that the real world had ceased to exist. It was only when a shadow fell across the kitchen floor that I turned, and he was there. Leo, my real grandson. He was standing in the doorway, holding his keys, a bag of groceries from the local market dangling from his other hand. For a single, disorienting second, my mind shattered. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over me. He was here. He was safe. The voice on the phone was a lie, a ghost, a mistake. The nightmare was over. I remember a strangled, happy sob escaping my throat. I lowered the phone slightly from my ear, my eyes wide, and I gestured frantically at the receiver, a silent, desperate attempt to convey the impossible madness of the situation. Leo looked at me. He looked at my pale, sweating face, at the phone clutched in my trembling hand, and he did not look surprised. There was no shock, no confusion, no alarm. There was only a flicker of something in his eyes, something cold and flat and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the look of a man seeing something he had expected to see. He understood the scene instantly. He knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. He said nothing. He simply held my gaze for a moment, then broke eye contact, his expression one of faint, weary annoyance, as if he had walked in on a tedious family argument he wanted no part of. He turned, walked to the refrigerator, and pulled out a bottle of water. He leaned against the counter, twisted the cap off, and took a long, slow drink, his eyes looking at nothing. He was waiting for me to finish. The voice on the phone was still talking, a meaningless, buzzing insect in my ear. All sound, all thought, all feeling had contracted to the single horrifying image of my grandson, leaning against my counter, drinking his water, while a stranger pretending to be him methodically and patiently stripped me of the last of my savings. The world went silent. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute. It was like a physical event, a geological shift that cracked the very foundations of my reality. He knew. He had known all along. Every dismissive sigh, every piece of condescending advice had not been ignorance. It had been a deliberate act of concealment. He had been a silent, willing spectator to my own personal crucifixion. The slow, methodical lowering of my hand to the telephone cradle was the heaviest physical act of my life. The click as the receiver settled into place was the sound of a door slamming shut on a life I once knew. Leo finished his water. He tossed the empty bottle into the recycling bin with a clatter. He looked at me, his face a blank mask, and then walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door open and then close. He was gone. I stood alone in the ringing silence, a stranger in my own home. The grief was a physical pressure, a weight trying to crush my chest. But then, something else began to stir in the rubble. It was cold. It was precise. It was the auditor, the engineer. An unrecoverable critical system failure had occurred. And now, a full diagnostic was required. The revelation in the kitchen did not leave me broken. It left me forged. The raging, chaotic fire of grief and betrayal had burned away the frightened old man, leaving behind something cold, hard, and sharp. The grandfather was gone, and the auditor had taken his place. My house, which for months had been a prison of anxiety and a tomb of memory, was now transformed. It became my headquarters, the command center for the most important investigation of my life. The emotional clutter was swept away, replaced by a singular, crystalline purpose. The system had been compromised. I would find the flaw. I would trace the corruption to its source, and I would burn it out. My first step was to impose order on the chaos. I went to the bank the next morning. The young teller who had processed my frantic wire transfers looked at me with an expression of pity. She saw a victim. I saw a client requesting services. I did not meet her pitying gaze. I calmly and precisely requested complete, printed records of every wire transfer made from my accounts over the past 6 months. I needed the raw data. Back at my desk, I cleared away the sentimental artifacts. The photograph of Leo was placed face down in a drawer. The map of the world was taken down from the wall, carefully rolled up, and stored in a closet. My study was no longer a place for reflection. It was a place for analysis. I spread the bank statements across the large dining room table, arranging them in chronological order. Each transfer was a wound, a testament to my own gullibility, but I felt no emotion looking at them now. They were simply data points. I took out a new clean ledger, its pages a pristine grid. At the top of the first page, I wrote a simple title, Case File, JL Fraud. I began the painstaking process of logging every transaction, the date, the amount, the receiving institution, the name of the beneficiary, each one a different, meaningless name, a ghost designed to dissipate the money trail. Next, I gathered the telecommunications data. I pulled out my phone bills from the past year, the thin paper rustling under my methodical touch. I cross-referenced the dates of the wire transfers with the call logs. And there they were, a recurring pattern of calls from unknown number, each one a prelude to a financial hemorrhage. I noted the duration of each call, the time of day. A pattern emerged. The calls were always late at night or early in the morning, times when the mind is at its most vulnerable, its defenses weakened by sleep and disorientation. It was a textbook psychological attack. I filled the pages of my new ledger with this data, my handwriting the same neat, block-printed script I had used for my household accounts. The act of documenting, of transforming my own trauma into a series of objective facts and figures, was calming. It was a reclamation of control. The next step was to acquire the necessary tools. I was done being a passive recipient of information. I needed to become a collector of evidence. From a dusty box in the back of a closet, I retrieved a piece of my old professional life. It was a compact reel-to-reel tape recorder, a beautiful piece of analog machinery from my days in the field. Alongside it was a small induction coil microphone designed to be placed on a telephone receiver to record both sides of a conversation. It was archaic technology by today's standards, but it was reliable, untraceable, and I understood its workings intimately. I spent an entire afternoon at my desk, meticulously cleaning the tape heads with alcohol and a soft cloth, replacing the hardened rubber on the pinch rollers, and testing the microphone. My hands, which had trembled with fear and rage just days before, were now perfectly steady, the movements of a technician at work. I set up the recorder on a small table next to the telephone in the hallway, the trap now officially set. With the data collected and the tools in place, I began my analysis. I spent 2 full days at the dining room table, a thermos of black coffee at my side, poring over the wire transfer records. The names of the recipients were useless, clearly disposable identities. But the routing information for the transfers themselves told a different story. The money, while sent to different people, was almost always processed through a small handful of independent check cashing and money transfer services. And most of those services were located in a single state. It was a bottleneck, a flaw in their system's design. To maintain their anonymity, they were relying on a small, interconnected network of less regulated financial businesses. This network was their weakness. It was the first pawn I would move. My first move would not be a direct assault. It would be an audit. I used my old offline computer to draft a letter. My tone was dry, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. I created a fictional entity, the Consumer Financial Integrity Group, a name that sounded both official and toothless. The letter was addressed not to the businesses themselves, but to the state's Financial Regulatory Board, a copy of which, the letter noted, would be sent to the Consumer Protection Division of the state's Attorney General. The letter did not accuse anyone of a crime. It simply stated that our analysis of public financial data had revealed a statistically significant anomaly in wire transfers originating from the Midwest and terminating at a specific cluster of licensed money transfer businesses. It politely inquired if the board was confident that these businesses were in full compliance with federal anti-money laundering protocols, particularly regarding out-of-state transfers to senior citizens. It was a simple, bureaucratic inquiry, a piece of paper designed to trigger a long and unpleasant bureaucratic process. It was a letter that would force the regulators to start asking questions, and in doing so, would apply pressure to the very network my enemies relied upon. I printed the letter at the public library. I bought a single stamp from a vending machine. I drove to a neighboring town and dropped the sealed envelope into a blue USPS mailbox on a quiet street corner. The act itself was small, anticlimactic. There was no explosion, no immediate satisfaction. But as I walked away from the mailbox, I felt a profound sense of quiet purpose. I had just thrown the first small, sharp gear into the smooth workings of their machine. I drove home, returned to my study, and sat down at the table next to the telephone. I looked at the tape recorder, its empty reels waiting patiently. The audit had begun. And now, I was ready for the phone to ring. My days were now measured by the slow, methodical turning of the tape reels on my recording machine and the meticulous entries in my new ledger. The house had become a fortress of quiet, focused work. I was gathering evidence, analyzing patterns, building my case with the same dispassionate precision I had once applied to auditing corporate telephone networks. This work was a shield, a wall of logic and procedure I built around myself to keep the raw, chaotic emotions at bay. But in the long, silent hours of the night, when the work was done and the house was still, the shield would sometimes fail. In those moments, the tactical questions of how they had betrayed me would fade, replaced by the single, haunting, and far more painful question: why? I could understand the faceless greed of the man on the phone, but the cold, profound indifference of my own grandson remained a black hole in my understanding. It was a critical system failure I could not explain. One evening, searching for a piece of data in my files, my hand brushed against the drawer where I had placed Leo's photograph. On impulse, I pulled it out. The smiling, confident young man in the graduation gown stared back at me, a stranger from a time before the fall. I looked into his eyes, searching for a hint of the coldness I now knew lay behind them. And as I stared, the image began to blur, the neat study dissolving around me, the silence replaced by the hushed, suffocating murmur of a house full of grief. The memory rose up unbidden, a ghost I had kept locked away for 15 years, and pulled me under. It was the day after my son David's funeral. The house, this very house, was filled with a sea of dark suits and somber faces. Relatives and neighbors moved through the rooms with a preternatural quiet, their voices low, their movements cautious, as if a loud noise might shatter the fragile composure of the universe. The air was thick with the cloying scent of funeral lilies and the aroma of the baked casseroles and hams that people bring in a time of tragedy. I was the center of it all, the patriarch, the chief mourner. I stood by the fireplace, accepting condolences, my hand shaken by dozens of people, my ears filled with their well-meaning, useless platitudes. I was numb, a hollowed-out automaton going through the motions. My grief was a white-hot, silent thing, too vast and terrible to be shared. I felt a profound, untethered rage at the sheer injustice of a father having to bury his son. Through the haze of my own pain, I began to search for Leo. He was 13, a boy teetering on the precipice of manhood, now without a father to guide him. I scanned the room of murmuring adults and found him. He was not where he was supposed to be, standing beside me, accepting the sympathies of the community. He was in a corner of the living room, tucked into the armchair that used to be his father's favorite, completely absorbed in a small, handheld video game. His face was illuminated by the screen's pale, flickering light. The sound was off, but his thumbs moved with a frantic, silent intensity. He was in another world, a world of digital combat and simple, achievable objectives, a world away from the incomprehensible loss that filled this house. To others, it might have been a child's coping mechanism, a retreat into a manageable reality when the real one had become too painful. But to me, in the raw, unforgiving clarity of my grief, it was a profound act of desecration. He was sitting in his dead father's chair, ignoring the rituals of mourning, disrespecting the memory of the man who had given him everything. I saw not a grieving boy, but a sullen, unfeeling stranger. The anger I felt towards the universe, so vast and directionless, suddenly found a target. I moved through the crowd, my progress a silent, determined path through the sea of dark suits. I stood before him, a tall, grim shadow blocking the light from his game. He looked up, his eyes wide and startled, pulled abruptly from his digital refuge. I did not speak. I simply reached down and took the game from his hands. His fingers went limp, offering no resistance. I closed the device and placed it on a nearby table with a definitive click. Then I put a hand on his shoulder, my grip firm, and guided him out of the chair and into the relative privacy of the hallway. I stood him in front of the large, framed portrait of his father that hung on the wall, the one of him smiling on a fishing trip. I pointed to the photograph, my finger jabbing at the air, my face a mask of cold, righteous fury. I was demanding a penance of tears, a performance of grief that would match the inferno of my own. I needed to see his pain to validate mine. He stared at his father's smiling face, and then he looked at me. And in his eyes, I did not see the dawning recognition of his own disrespect. I saw something that, at the time, I misinterpreted as defiance. It was a look of confusion, of fear, and of a deep, wounded pride. His face was pale, his jaw set. He was not sullen. He was in shock, a child drowning in a sea of adult emotions he did not have the tools to navigate. He was grieving in his own silent, terrified way, and I, his own grandfather, was not comforting him, but court-martialing him for it. His refusal to cry, to perform the role I had assigned him, felt like a final, terrible betrayal. The last piece of my son, his own child, was a stranger to me. I looked at him, this silent, stubborn boy, and my heart hardened into a block of ice. I took a step back, a gesture of final, profound dismissal. I turned my back on him and walked away, leaving him alone in the hallway with the ghost of his father. The memory released its grip. I was back in my study, the photograph of the college graduate still in my hand. The silence of the room was absolute. I understood now. Leo's cold, casual indifference as he stood in my kitchen was not a new creation. It was a ghost of my own making. The seed of his betrayal had been planted 15 years ago, in the fertile soil of my own unendurable grief. On the worst day of his life, I had not offered him comfort. I had offered him judgment, and he had, in his own patient, silent way, finally returned the favor. The knowledge brought me no peace. It was just another deeper layer of the ruin. The knowledge of my grandson's complicity did not break me. It focused me. The grief, a wild and useless fire, had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, hard clarity of a battlefield assessment. I now understood the enemy. It was not a single entity, but a conspiracy with two heads: the voice, the operator who executed the attacks, and Leo, the strategist who provided the intelligence that made them so devastatingly effective. My objective, therefore, was simple. A fundamental principle of both warfare and systems engineering is that the strength of any chain is determined by its weakest link. I would not attack the chain. I would attack the link that bound them together. I would sever their connection with the universal solvent of paranoia and distrust. My new mission was to turn them against one another. The trap required fresh bait. I had to wait for the phone to ring again, for the phantom Leo to make his next move. The wait was different this time. There was no anxiety, no dread. There was only the patient, focused calm of a hunter in a blind. When the call finally came, 2 days later, I was ready. The reel-to-reel recorder, a silent, spinning witness, was engaged. The story this time was about a stolen laptop containing a critical work project, a desperate need for funds to replace it before his boss found out. I played my part perfectly. I was the flustered, hesitant old man, my voice trembling with a carefully manufactured blend of fear and exasperation. I allowed myself to be persuaded, to be worn down by his practiced, panicked pleading. I agreed, with a great show of reluctance, to wire the money the next morning. The voice hung up, confident in his victory. He did not know that he had just willingly stepped into the first loop of a trap from which he would not escape. My countermove was a two-pronged attack, designed to strike both conspirators simultaneously from different, untraceable directions. The first target was the voice. I needed to introduce a fatal element of doubt into his mind about the reliability of his inside man. Using a public computer at the library, I spent an entire afternoon researching voice modulation software and cheap anonymous VoIP calling services. That evening, from the same burner phone I had used before, but now routed through a series of digital relays that would make the call virtually untraceable, I called the number the voice had once used in an early text message. He answered on the second ring. I activated the software, pitching my voice lower, adding a slight, synthetic rasp. I did not identify myself. I simply began. I presented myself as a third party, an interested observer. I informed him that his recent activities targeting assets in the Chicago area had come to our attention. I used vague, official-sounding language. Cross-state financial exploitation. Vulnerable persons enforcement. Then I delivered the payload. I told him that the weak link in his operation was his local source. I explained that the source, the grandson, was getting sloppy, leaving a trail. To make the threat real, I used a piece of information that only I could know. During a recent brief visit before the final revelation, I had noticed Leo wearing a new, expensive diver's watch. It was the kind of foolish, conspicuous purchase a young man flush with unearned cash might make. I said into the phone, my modulated voice a low growl, that his source was drawing attention to himself, flashing new money around, wearing a watch he couldn't possibly afford on his salary. I suggested that a man so careless with his own security was likely to be just as careless with his partner's. I then hung up without another word. I had just planted a seed of pure poison, the idea that his trusted partner was a liability who could bring the entire operation crashing down. The second prong of the attack was for Leo. It needed to be more personal, more psychological. It had to target his ego, his belief that he was intellectually superior to the old man he was betraying. From the same library computer, I created another anonymous email address. I composed a message to his personal email account, an address I had in my old handwritten address book from years ago. The email contained no text in the body. The subject line was a single phrase, a quote from a book on engineering I had given him when he started college. Every system has a failure point. The only attachment was a single scanned image. It was a page from an old, declassified Air Force technical manual I had co-authored in the 1970s. The page detailed a specific method for analyzing and tracing complex signal relays in analog telecommunication networks. I used a simple image editor to draw a single red circle around a paragraph describing how even the most sophisticated masking techniques leave a unique, traceable electronic signature. It was an archaic piece of information, useless in today's digital world, but Leo would not know that. To him, it would be a clear, terrifying message. I know what you are doing, and I know more about this world than you can possibly imagine. This is my field, and you are an amateur playing in it. It was a direct assault on his arrogance, a hint that the game was far more complex than he believed. The results of my psychological salvo were not immediately visible, but they were detectable. A few days later, the phantom Leo called again, much sooner than I expected. His tone was different. The feigned panic was still there, but underneath it was a new, hard edge of aggression and paranoia. He was pushing too hard, his questions subtly probing, trying to ascertain if I had spoken to anyone, if anything was amiss. I played my part, the confused and frightened victim, while the reels of my recorder spun, capturing every nuance of his strained, anxious voice. He was rattled. My anonymous call had worked. He no longer trusted his source. Later that evening, I received a text message from the real Leo. It was the first time he had initiated contact in weeks. The message was jarringly casual, asking if I was feeling okay, if I needed anything. It was a reconnaissance mission. My email had hit its mark, and he was now trying to gauge my state of mind, to see if the senile old man had suddenly developed a hidden, intellectual bite. I replied with a simple, grandfatherly message, thanking him for his concern and saying I was fine, just tired. My refusal to acknowledge his veiled probe, I knew, would be more unnerving than any open accusation. I had turned the board around. They were no longer the confident predators. They were two suspicious, frightened conspirators, suddenly unsure of the rules of the game, and more importantly, of each other. My investigation had, until this point, been a solitary endeavor, a war waged from the silent fortress of my home. I had my data, my recorder, and my plan, but I was operating in a vacuum. I was an auditor without access to the inner workings of the system I was trying to dismantle. I was tracing the edges of the conspiracy, but I needed a way inside. The financial network they used was the key, but the bank statements on my dining room table were like a map written in a foreign language. I could see the names of towns and the numbers of roads, but I did not understand the terrain. I knew I needed an interpreter. This knowledge led me back to the bank, not as a victim, but as a researcher with a specific, targeted line of inquiry. I approached the counter and found myself by chance in front of the same young teller who had processed my final, frantic wire transfer. Her name, according to the small plaque on her desk, was Maria. I remembered the look of deep, professional concern in her eyes that day, a look I had been too lost in my own panic to properly register at the time. Today, I was different. I was not a flustered old man. I was calm, organized, and I had a list of precise questions regarding the beneficiary institutions listed on my statements. I did not ask for my money back. I asked for clarification on routing protocols and the corporate registrations of the independent transfer services that had been used. My questions were technical, specific, the questions of an analyst, not a grieving grandfather. She handled my requests with a quiet efficiency, but I could see her watching me, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the new ledger I placed on the counter, its pages filled with my neat, methodical handwriting. She saw the timeline of calls and the corresponding list of transfers. She recognized the pattern. I was not just a victim. I was a victim who was fighting back, trying to make sense of the wreckage. After she had printed the documents I'd requested, and as I was gathering my papers, she made a decision. She caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, then gestured with her eyes towards the clock on the wall, and then the door. It was a silent, discreet message. She was going on her break. She would meet me outside. I was wary. My trust was a bankrupt currency, and I was not inclined to extend credit to a stranger. But my instincts, the same instincts that had served me for 40 years as an auditor, told me that her concern was genuine. I waited on a bench outside the bank, the cool autumn air a welcome change from the stuffy formal atmosphere inside. A few minutes later, she emerged, her professional bank uniform now covered by a simple coat. She approached not with the false sympathy I had come to dread, but with a look of straightforward, professional respect. She suggested we go to the small coffee shop next door, a place where the conversation could not be overheard by her colleagues or recorded by the bank's security cameras. In the quiet corner of the coffee shop, surrounded by the comforting aroma of roasted coffee beans, I made a calculated risk. I decided to trust her. I did not tell her the full story. The raw, painful truth of my grandson's involvement was a secret too deep and too dangerous to share. I presented myself as the classic victim of a grandparent scam, a lonely old man who had been thoroughly and professionally deceived. I laid out the facts as I had recorded them in my ledger, showing her the timeline, the amounts, the network of faceless names and obscure transfer services. I presented my case not as a plea for sympathy, but as a technical problem I was trying to solve. She listened with an intense, focused empathy that was unlike anything I had yet encountered. When I was finished, she did not offer platitudes or apologies. Instead, she told me her own story. Her grandfather, a man she had adored, had been the victim of a similar, though smaller, scam a few years prior. She described, in a quiet, controlled voice, the shame it had brought upon him, the way he had withdrawn into himself, the feeling of helplessness that had consumed her family as they watched the authorities dismiss the case as just another unsolvable bit of fraud. That experience, she explained, was the reason she had gone into banking. She had specialized in their fraud detection department, focusing specifically on schemes that targeted the elderly. My story was not just a case file to her. It was a ghost from her own past. Her motivation was not just professional, it was personal. In that moment, a bond of shared experience was forged between us. She looked at my ledger, at my meticulous, if amateurish, investigation, and she saw not a fool, but a fellow soldier. She made an offer. She explained the strict privacy laws that bound her, the professional risks of getting involved. She could not officially investigate without a police report, but unofficially, she could be my interpreter. She could look at the language I did not understand, the routing numbers, the bank identification codes, the corporate shells, and she could translate it for me. She could use her access to internal banking databases to see which of these transfer services were legitimate businesses and which were known fronts, part of established international fraud networks. She was offering me the key to a door I could not open on my own. I slid my ledger across the small table. She opened it, and for a long moment she studied my handwriting, my charts, my methodical documentation of my own ruin. A look of profound respect dawned on her face. She took a pen from her purse and began to work. She moved through the pages, her pen flying, making notes in the margins, circling names, drawing lines to connect seemingly disparate transactions. She explained that the different beneficiary names were meaningless, but the account numbers themselves told a story. She showed me how several of the transfers, though sent to different people, had ultimately been funneled into a single, high-risk account based in a different country. She identified 2 of the transfer services as shell corporations with links to ongoing federal investigations. The foreign language of my bank statements began to resolve into a clear, coherent narrative of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. When she was done, my ledger was no longer just a record of my losses. It was a strategic document, a map of my enemy's financial empire, with its vulnerabilities now clearly marked in her neat blue ink. We left the coffee shop and stood for a moment on the sidewalk. She had given me more in 1 hour than I had managed to uncover in weeks of solitary work. I had entered the bank a lone investigator. I left with an ally, an inside source who understood the enemy's language and shared my resolve. As I walked home through the crisp afternoon air, the weight of my mission felt, for the first time, manageable. I was no longer fighting a ghost. I now knew the names of its banks. The time for indirect action, for throwing stones from the shadows, was over. The seeds of paranoia I had planted between my grandson and his faceless accomplice had been given time to sprout. Now, it was time to step out of the shadows and confront the architect of my betrayal directly. This confrontation would not be an emotional outburst, but a carefully planned and executed maneuver, designed to seize control of the battlefield in a single, decisive stroke. I sent him a text message from my own phone, an act that I knew would be a shock in itself after weeks of my deliberate silence. The message was simple, containing only the name of a restaurant, a date, and a time. It was an invitation that I knew would feel like a summons, a command performance he would be too afraid to refuse. I chose the location with the precision of a master strategist, Genevieve's, An old Italian restaurant downtown with dark wood paneling, white tablecloths, and waiters who had worked there for 30 years. It was a place of ghosts. It was where I had taken my son, David, for his 16th birthday. It was where I had taken Leo for a celebratory dinner after he had won his high school science fair. It was a place steeped in the history of our family's happier times, and I intended to use that history as a weapon. I arrived a half an hour early and secured our old booth in the back, a quiet, secluded corner. I sat with my back to the wall, a clear view of the entire room before me. I was not there as a grandfather hoping for a reconciliation. I was there as an auditor, about to present my findings. Leo arrived exactly on time, a sign of his anxiety. He was dressed in his usual uniform of expensive, casual success, but the clothes hung on him differently. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, hunted look. He scanned the room as he approached, his eyes darting around, half expecting to see a lawyer or a police officer waiting for him. Seeing me sitting alone, calmly sipping a glass of water, seemed to unnerve him more than any overt threat could have. He slid into the booth opposite me, his movements stiff, his face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality that did nothing to hide the fear in his eyes. I did not begin with accusations. I began with normalcy, a far crueler tactic. I smiled, a small, gentle smile. I gestured for the waiter, an old man named Marco who had served us a dozen times over the years. I ordered a plate of fried calamari for the table, the same appetizer we had always shared. This deliberate performance of our old familiar ritual was a powerful act of psychological warfare. He had come prepared for a fight, for yelling, for tears. He was not prepared for this quiet, suffocating nostalgia. It stripped him of his defenses, forcing him back into the role of the grandson, a role he was no longer fit to play. He fidgeted with his silverware, his gaze unable to meet mine for more than a second, his attempts at small talk dying in the thick, heavy silence between us. The calamari arrived. We ate. I ate slowly, deliberately, while he pushed the food around his plate, his appetite clearly gone. When the waiter had cleared the plates, in the quiet interlude before our main courses were due to arrive, I made my move. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I saw Leo flinch, his body tensing, his eyes darting down to my pocket, expecting me to produce a legal document, a file, the instrument of his destruction. Instead, my hand emerged with a small black MP3 player and a pair of cheap white earbuds. The technology looked foreign and slightly absurd in my old wrinkled hands. I placed the device and the earbuds on the pristine white tablecloth. They sat there between us, a starkly modern intrusion into the old-world elegance of the restaurant. I did not speak. I simply pushed them slowly across the table towards him. He stared at the small plastic object as if it were a venomous snake. His face was a battleground of fear, confusion, and a desperate, clawing curiosity. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, with a hesitant, trembling hand, he picked up the earbuds and placed them in his ears. He was isolating himself, cutting himself off from the quiet murmur of the restaurant, creating a private, soundproof chamber for the evidence I was about to present. I leaned forward and pressed the small, triangular play button. I watched his face. I could not hear what he was hearing, but I had rehearsed the recording in my mind 100 times. I knew that he was first hearing the panicked, sobbing voice of the scammer, the phantom Leo, in the middle of his last, desperate plea for money. I saw a flicker of recognition, a shadow of contempt for the man's clumsy performance. Then I knew the audio was shifting. I watched his brow furrow in confusion as a second voice entered the recording. It was his own voice, the real Leo, taken from a call a month prior. His tone was bored, dismissive, dripping with a casual cruelty as he brushed off my concerns about the scam calls. And then came the final, brutal stroke. Using the audio editing software I had spent 2 weeks learning at the public library, I had layered the two voices. The desperate, pleading whine of the scammer and the cold, indifferent dismissal of my grandson began to merge, their tones and cadences weaving together until they became a single, monstrous voice of betrayal. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, grayish white. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating with a look of pure, primal terror. The mask of neutrality was not just cracked, it was utterly obliterated. He was seeing the full, undeniable truth of his crime presented to him not as an accusation, but as an inescapable acoustic fact. He ripped the earbuds from his ears as if they were physically burning him, throwing them onto the table. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, no sound coming out. He was completely and utterly exposed. He was no longer the clever predator. He was just a boy, caught in a lie of his own making, staring into the calm, unforgiving eyes of the man he had underestimated so completely. The game had just been irrevocably changed, and I had not said a single word. The waiter had cleared away the untouched plates from our table, leaving the white tablecloth a stark, empty battlefield. I had left Leo there, a ghost in the wreckage of his own making, and walked out into the cold night air. Back in the sterile silence of my apartment, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbed away, leaving a familiar hollow ache in its place. The MP3 player, my weapon, lay on the table, a small black object of immense power. But I felt no triumph. My victory had been to prove to my grandson that I was not a fool. But in doing so, I had been forced to confront the full, tragic scope of his own failings. I walked into my study and looked at the photographs on the bookshelf, not the picture of Leo, but the one beside it. It was my son, David, Leo's father, taken on a fishing trip years ago. He was smiling, holding up a small, unimpressive fish with a look of pure, uncomplicated joy. Looking at his face, the face of the man he had been, the memory I had buried for so long rose up, not as a ghost this time, but as a judge. The memory began a year after the funeral. The raw, searing pain of David's sudden death had cooled into a permanent, low-grade ache, a feature of my new emotional landscape. His wife, unable to stay in the house where every corner held a memory, had moved with a young Leo to a smaller apartment across town, leaving me with the heartbreaking task of sorting through the worldly possessions my son had left behind. I spent my weekends in his house, a quiet suburban home that had become a perfect, tragic museum of a life cut short. The air was thick with his presence. His worn leather jacket was still slung over a dining room chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the table next to his favorite coffee mug. Each object was a new, small wound. I was working in his small home office, a room filled with books on history and a collection of model airplanes he had never found the time to build. My task was to sort through his paperwork, to close out his accounts, to put a final, full stop at the end of the sentence of his life. Beneath his desk, tucked away in the shadows, I found a small, locked metal file box. It was a simple, cheap thing, and I pried the lock open easily with a screwdriver from his toolbox. I had expected to find old letters, photographs, perhaps a forgotten memento. I did not expect to find a secret life. The box was filled to the brim with official-looking envelopes. I pulled them out, my hands starting to tremble. They were credit card statements, dozens of them, from banks I didn't recognize. There were loan documents from high-interest lenders, and at the bottom, there was a stack of letters, each one in a different colored envelope, the language inside escalating from polite reminders to angry, bold-faced demands, and finally, to formal notices of legal action. I slid to the floor, the contents of the box spread out around me on the carpet. The engineer in me, the auditor, took over, a desperate attempt to impose order on the emotional chaos that was threatening to drown me. I began to sort the papers, creating neat piles for each creditor. I found a notepad and a pen and began to add up the numbers. My son, my quiet, responsible David, had been living a lie. He had been drowning in a sea of secret debt. The numbers grew with each new statement I opened, the total climbing to a figure that was staggering, a figure that would not only consume his entire modest estate, but leave his wife and son with nothing but the black mark of his bankruptcy. It was a second death. The man I had known, the son I had been so proud of, was replaced by a stranger, a man who had been living a life of quiet, desperate panic, too proud or too ashamed to ask for help. I sat there on the floor of his office for hours, surrounded by the evidence of his secret shame, and I was faced with a choice. I could follow the rules. I could turn this all over to the lawyers, let the creditors pick over the bones of his estate, and allow his wife and son to face the public humiliation of his failure. It was the logical, orderly thing to do. Or I could intervene. I looked around the room, at the life he had built. On the wall, taped next to his bookshelf, was a child's drawing of a smiling stick figure holding a fish. It was signed in a clumsy crayon scrawl, Leo, my grandson. I thought of the future that awaited him, a future that would begin under the shadow of his father's secret disgrace. And then I thought of my own future. I thought of the map on my wall, of the pins waiting in their box. I thought of the retirement account Eleanor and I had so carefully nurtured for 30 years, the fund for our travels, for our dream of seeing the green hills of Ireland and the blue waters of Greece. The decision was not a struggle. In the end, it wasn't a choice at all. It was a father's final duty. I would protect my son's memory, and I would secure my grandson's future. I would pay the price. I spent the next month in a quiet, secret flurry of activity. I liquidated our travel fund. I sold a small portfolio of stocks I had inherited from my own father. One by one, I wrote the checks, settling the debts, silencing the creditors. Each check I wrote was a piece of my own future, a dream I was trading away. I never told anyone the full extent of it. I told Eleanor only that there were some unexpected expenses in settling David's estate, a lie of omission that I would carry with me for the rest of her life. I certainly never told Leo. I wanted him to remember his father as the hero he had always believed him to be. I wanted him to start his life with a clean slate, unburdened by the mistakes of the past. The memory faded, and I was back in my barren apartment, the photograph of my son in my hand. The full weight of Leo's betrayal finally settled upon me, a crushing physical force. The money he had so casually allowed the scammers to steal was not just money. It was the ghost of that sacrifice. It was the price of the trip to Ireland we never took. It was the cost of the Greek islands we would never see. It was the final, desecrated remnant of the dream I had given up to protect his father's name, and to give him, my grandson, a life free from shame. He had not just allowed a stranger to rob his grandfather. He had, in his cold, profound indifference, become an accomplice in the theft of his own father's honor. And in that quiet, terrible understanding, my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. This was no longer just about the money. This was about defending the memory of a sacrifice he had never even known was made. The week following our encounter at the restaurant was a study in silence. I did not contact him. I did not have my lawyer send any further notices. I simply let him exist in the new reality I had created for him, a world in which I was no longer a deluded old fool, but an omniscient, patient adversary. I knew that the silence, punctuated only by the memory of that damning audio recording, would be a more effective form of torture than any threat. Fear, especially the fear of the unknown, is a powerful solvent. I gave it 7 days to dissolve his arrogance, to eat away at his composure, and to leave him raw and ready for the final act of his own tragic play. I was not seeking to torment him for the sake of cruelty. I was giving him time to walk the long, lonely road to the crossroads I was about to present him with. The summons was a simple text message sent from my phone to his. It contained only the name of a public place, Lincoln Park, and a time, noon, the next day. I chose the location deliberately. Not a restaurant full of ghosts, but an open, neutral space, a bench overlooking the gray, choppy waters of Lake Michigan. It was a place with a wide horizon, a place with nowhere to hide. I was not offering a meal this time. I was offering a choice, and such a choice required the open air and the cold, impartial light of day. I arrived early, as was my habit. I sat on the designated bench, the autumn wind coming off the lake, whipping at my coat. The sky was a vast, indifferent sheet of gray. I felt a strange sense of calm, the quiet focus of a man who has already calculated all the variables and is simply waiting to observe the final, inevitable outcome. He was late, a small final act of defiance that I had anticipated. When he finally appeared, he was a different man from the one who had entered the restaurant a week prior. The fear had hollowed him out. He looked as if he hadn't slept in a week, his face pale and drawn, his expensive coat hanging loosely on his frame. He approached the bench with the hesitant, shuffling gait of a man walking to his own sentencing. He did not meet my eyes. He sat at the furthest possible end of the long bench, creating a stark, physical representation of the chasm that now lay between us. We sat in silence for a long time, two strangers on a park bench, the only sounds the cry of the gulls and the relentless churn of the waves against the shore. I did not begin with the past. I began with the present. I reached into my coat and placed a single object on the wooden slats of the bench between us. It was my old, thick, leather-bound financial ledger, the one in which I had meticulously documented his crime. It lay there, a heavy, silent accusation, the physical embodiment of his betrayal. His eyes darted to it and then quickly away, as if looking at it might burn him. Then I laid out the terms of his last chance. I placed a single typed sheet of paper on top of the ledger. It was a full confession, detailing his knowledge of the scam, his willing complicity, and his motives rooted in a long-held grudge. At the bottom was a blank line for his signature. Next to it, I placed a second document. It was a legally binding agreement. If he signed the confession, I would not take it to the police. Instead, the confession would become a tool. He would agree to cooperate fully with me and my associates to track, identify, and recover the stolen funds from the professional scammers. He would use his intimate knowledge of their methods to help dismantle their operation. The third document I laid out was a brochure for a local senior center. I had highlighted their program on elder fraud prevention. His second condition was to commit to 1 year of volunteer service there, to spend his weekends teaching other elderly people how to recognize the very scams he had enabled, to use his guilt as a shield for others. It was a path to atonement, a difficult and humbling one, but a path back to a life of meaning. The final condition was unwritten. I simply took out my wallet and opened it to the empty plastic sleeve where the photograph of my wife had always been. I left the wallet open on the bench. He stared at the array of objects between us, the ledger of his crime, the confession of his guilt, the contract for his redemption, and the empty space that represented his final, petty cruelty. I watched him. I saw the war in his eyes. I saw the flicker of profound shame as he read the confession, the humiliation as he looked at the volunteer brochure. He looked out at the gray, unforgiving water of the lake, his jaw working silently. For a long, pregnant moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of the boy he once was, a flicker of a soul grappling with the enormity of its own failure. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching my face for something, a sign of weakness, a hint of doubt, a crack in my resolve. He found none. My expression was calm, my gaze steady. I was not his grandfather offering a hug. I was the auditor, presenting the final, unchangeable terms of the audit. And in that moment, I saw him make his choice. The flicker of shame was extinguished, snuffed out by a sudden hot wave of his old familiar resentment. The wound I had inflicted on him as a boy proved to be deeper and more powerful than the crime he had committed as a man. He saw my offer not as an act of mercy, but as a final, humiliating act of control. The confession was not a key to freedom. It was a chain I would hold over him forever. The volunteer work was not penance. It was a public shaming. He straightened his shoulders. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a cold, brittle anger. He picked up the pen. My heart, against my own better judgment, gave a small, hopeful leap. He held the pen over the signature line of the confession for a long second. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he drew a single, thick, angry black line through the entire document, from top to bottom. He tossed the pen onto the bench, the clatter unnaturally loud in the quiet air. He stood up, gave me one last look of pure, unadulterated contempt, and turned his back on me. He walked away without a word, his posture a study in defiant, self-destructive pride. I watched him go until he was just a small, distant figure disappearing into the grayness of the city. The last chance was gone. I calmly gathered the papers, including the one he had defaced. The path of redemption was now closed. All that was left was the path of justice. The rejection at the park bench was not an endpoint. It was a final authorization. My grandson's definitive act of contempt had severed the last, fraying thread of familial sentiment that had tempered my actions. The part of me that had hoped for his redemption was now silent. All that remained was the auditor and the final, unavoidable task of balancing the books. The path of mercy was closed. The path of justice was now the only one left to walk. I spent the next month in quiet, meticulous preparation. My apartment, once a command center for investigation, was now a staging ground for a final, decisive strike. I was no longer gathering intelligence. I was coordinating assets, preparing for a controlled demolition of the life my grandson had built upon the foundations of his deceit. The target was not Leo himself, but his reputation, the carefully constructed edifice of success that I knew he valued more than anything. I learned from a local business journal online that his company was a major sponsor of the city's annual Young Professional of the Year awards banquet. Not only that, but Leo himself, as a rising star in his firm, was scheduled to be a presenter, a role that would place him on a stage, in a spotlight, in a room full of his peers and superiors. It was a perfect stage for a public execution. I had my time, and I had my place. The plan was a multi-pronged assault, a series of coordinated events designed to converge on that single point in time and space, ensuring a total and irreversible system collapse. The first strike was silent and invisible. 2 weeks before the event, my lawyer, Mr. Davies, using the mountain of evidence I had gathered, the audio recordings, the financial records deciphered by Maria, and Leo's own defaced confession, filed a comprehensive and confidential report with the state's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. It was a slow-acting poison, a legal time bomb that would begin its work deep within the bowels of the bureaucracy. The second and third strikes were timed to coincide with the awards banquet itself. I made 2 calls. The first was to the investigative reporter who had shown interest in the case. I provided her and her news organization with an exclusive, embargoed package of evidence, including curated audio clips and a full narrative of the fraud, to be published on their website at precisely 8 o'clock on the night of the event. My second call was to the lead detective on the Financial Crimes Unit, a man my lawyer had already briefed. I anonymously informed him that the subject of their ongoing investigation would be in a public, enclosed space at that time, and that a major news story detailing his crimes was about to break, suggesting that his presence might be required to prevent the subject from fleeing. On the night of the banquet, I did not dress in a uniform or a suit. I wore a simple dark jacket and trousers, the clothes of an anonymous old man, a ghost in the machine. I took a taxi to the downtown hotel where the event was being held. I did not enter the grand ballroom. I took a seat in the hotel's quiet, dimly lit lobby bar at a small table that had a clear, unobstructed view of the ballroom's main entrance. I ordered a glass of water, and I waited. I was a general on a hill overlooking a battle he had already planned down to the last second. Through the open doors, I could see the spectacle. The room was a glittering sea of evening gowns and tuxedos. I saw Leo moving through the crowd, confident and charming, a drink in one hand, the other clapping a colleague on the back. He was at the absolute zenith of his fraudulent success, the center of his own glittering, artificial universe. At 7:45 p.m., as scheduled, I watched Mr. Davies arrive, accompanied by the quiet, dignified figures of the widow and her son, the victims of a 30-year-old crime that was about to finally see the light of day. They did not enter the ballroom, but waited patiently in the lobby, their presence a somber, silent indictment. At precisely 8 p.m., as Leo was being welcomed to the stage to present an award, I watched the reporter and her cameraman enter the lobby and position themselves near the ballroom doors. In my pocket, my phone vibrated with a news alert from the station. The story was live. Inside the ballroom, the first signs of the collapse began. A few people in the audience looked down at their phones, their faces illuminated by the screens. A murmur started at the back of the room, a low, spreading ripple of shock. I saw a man at a table near the front show his phone to his neighbor. The neighbor's eyes went wide. The ripple was becoming a wave. On stage, Leo, oblivious, was reading from a teleprompter, his voice smooth and confident. Then his own boss, seated at a table of honor, was discreetly approached from behind by two men in conservative suits, the detectives. They showed him something on a small tablet. The boss's face, which had been a mask of corporate pride, fell apart, his expression shifting from beaming approval to slack-jawed horror. The wave of awareness was now reaching the stage. Leo faltered, sensing the sudden, inexplicable shift in the room's atmosphere. He looked out and saw not a sea of admiring faces, but 100 pairs of eyes, all staring at him with a new, dawning expression of shock and disgust. The reporter and her cameraman made their move. They stepped into the ballroom, the camera's bright, harsh light cutting through the elegant dimness and fixing on Leo, trapping him in its beam. The reporter's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the murmuring. Her questions were like gunshots in the sudden silence, precise and deadly, about wire transfers, about his grandfather, about elder fraud. In that moment, Leo was no longer a successful young professional. He was a cornered, panicked animal, blinking in the sudden, brutal glare of public exposure. He looked from the camera to his boss's horrified face, to the hundreds of accusing eyes in the audience. He saw the detectives now walking calmly towards the stage. It was over. I watched his carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. I watched him crumble. I did not stay to see the end. My work was done. I calmly placed a few dollars on the bar for the water. I stood up and walked out of the hotel, leaving the ruin and the chaos behind me. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt only the quiet, profound finality of a ledger that had, at long last, been balanced. The system had been audited, the corruption had been purged, and the final report had just been made public. The explosive events of that night at the awards banquet did not end with a bang, but faded into a series of quiet, bureaucratic echoes. The war was over, the final decisive blow had been struck, and I retreated from the field, leaving the work of sifting through the wreckage to others. I became a ghost again, a silent observer in my anonymous apartment, monitoring the fallout of my own carefully engineered earthquake through the impersonal mediums of the news and official correspondence. There was no triumph, no elation. There was only the grim, methodical process of watching a life I had once nurtured, be systematically dismantled and catalogued as a public ruin. The local news was a firestorm for 48 hours, then quickly cooled to smoldering embers. I would sit at a computer terminal in the public library, a place of profound silence, and read the stories about the scandal. The initial reports were sensational, featuring a grainy, zoomed-in photograph of Leo's terrified face, captured by the news camera in the instant his world fell apart. The articles detailed the dramatic scene at the banquet, the arrival of the police, the public accusations. Then, the follow-up pieces became more analytical. Financial reporters dissected the scam, using the information I had provided to the journalist to map out the network of money mules and shell corporations. Legal experts were quoted, discussing the nuances of elder fraud and the severity of the potential charges. My grandson's name was now irrevocably linked with a particularly cruel and predatory form of crime. His photograph was beside the headline. His company issued a terse public statement, terminating his employment and expressing their shock and dismay. In the space of a single news cycle, he had become a pariah. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from my lawyer, Mr. Davies. It was not a call to action, but a final report. Inside, there was no emotional language, only the cold, precise prose of legal summary. It detailed the official opening of a criminal investigation into Leo and his associates. It confirmed that the bank had put a lien on all his assets, freezing the contents of his accounts and beginning foreclosure proceedings on the house. The civil suit, filed by the widow, was moving forward unopposed. The documents were a formal autopsy of a life, each page a new incision revealing the extent of the decay. The report also contained a brief, satisfying addendum. My anonymous tip to the State Financial Regulatory Board, my very first move, had, in the wake of the public scandal, borne fruit. The small money transfer services I had flagged were now under a full-scale audit, and their records had provided the authorities with a treasure trove of information, leading to a wider investigation into a massive interstate fraud ring. My small, quiet act of rebellion had, it seemed, started an avalanche. I felt a certain grim satisfaction in that knowledge, the feeling of an engineer who sees a failing system finally being repaired. But it was a distant, intellectual satisfaction that did nothing to warm the cold, empty space in my own life. I took to driving at night, with no destination in mind, just moving through the city's anonymous streets. One evening, following a piece of information from a brief, final note from Maria, I found myself in a part of the city I had only ever seen from the expressway. It was a landscape of transient hotels and bleak industrial warehouses. This is where he was now. I parked my truck in the shadows across the street from a rundown, weekly rate motel, a place whose flickering neon sign promised only a desperate, temporary refuge. I did not have to wait long. I saw him. He emerged from one of the motel room doors, a hunched, anonymous figure in the dim yellow light of the walkway. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a thin, cheap-looking hooded sweatshirt and worn jeans. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his face gaunt and pale under the hood, a landscape of sharp angles and dark shadows. He walked with his head down, his shoulders stooped, as if the weight of the sky itself was pressing down upon him. He was not the confident predator from the restaurant, nor the defiant boy from the park bench. He was just a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a man, haunted by the consequences of his own choices. He walked to a vending machine at the end of the walkway, inserted a few coins, and watched as a small bag of chips dropped into the slot. That was his dinner. The sight brought me no pleasure. There was no victory in it. There was only a profound, bottomless tragedy, the waste of a life, the ruin of a boy I had once taught to fish, now reduced to this pathetic, solitary existence. I had won. I had utterly and completely destroyed him, and the victory tasted like ash in my mouth. I drove back to my apartment. The image of his stooped, defeated figure burned into my mind. I walked into my study, my command center. The ledger, my case file, still sat on the desk, its pages filled with the meticulous record of my war. I looked at it for a long time, at the timeline of calls, the columns of stolen money, the notes on my grandson's long-held resentment. My audit was complete. The final accounting had been rendered. I picked up the heavy book, walked to the closet, and placed it in an old, empty box. I closed the flaps and pushed the box into the far, dark corner. I would not look at it again. The work was finished. I stood in the center of the silent room, alone with the ghosts of my family and the heavy, unshakable peace of a terrible, necessary duty finally discharged. The ruins were not just his, they were ours, and I knew I would have to live in them for the rest of my life. The roar of the city is gone. It has been replaced by the rhythmic, percussive sound of waves breaking on a rocky shore, and the high, lonely cry of gulls circling overhead. It has been 2 years since I closed the final grim chapter of my old life, and in that time, I have moved here, to a small, wind-beaten cottage on the coast of Maine. I do not own this place. I am a tenant, a transient, my worldly possessions confined to what could fit in the back of my old truck. After a lifetime spent building, acquiring, and securing a legacy, I have found that the greatest luxury is to own nothing that you are not prepared to walk away from. The house in Chicago, the vessel of my memories, is now just a property in a legal file somewhere. Here there are no ghosts. There is only the endless gray-green expanse of the Atlantic and the clean, salt-scrubbed air. My days are marked by the tides. I wake with the first pale light of dawn and walk the shoreline, my boots leaving fleeting prints in the damp sand. I collect pieces of sea glass, their sharp edges worn smooth by the relentless churn of the ocean, a metaphor I find both fitting and comforting. I have a small workshop here, a converted shed that smells of brine and sawdust. I build things, simple things. I repaired the cottage's storm-beaten shutters. I built a sturdy set of shelves for my books. I spend my afternoons crafting intricate, beautiful birdhouses from pieces of driftwood I find on my walks. I am not building for posterity. I am building for the simple, honest satisfaction of the work itself, for the feeling of creating a small piece of order and utility in a vast, chaotic world. It is, I have come to realize, a form of prayer. The last loose thread from my old life was snipped 6 months ago. A final letter arrived from Mr. Davies, my lawyer. It was a dense, formal document filled with the dry language of legal resolution. The various lawsuits had concluded. The assets of the fraud ring had been liquidated. After all the other victims and creditors had been paid, a small final sum of my own stolen money had been recovered. A cashier's check was enclosed. I looked at the slip of paper, at the figure typed in neat black ink. It was the final tally, the net profit of all my pain and all my planning. I held it for a moment. Then I walked to the small desk by the window. I endorsed the back of the check. Then I wrote a personal check of my own for the exact same amount. I made it payable to a small, underfunded pro bono legal clinic that helped elderly people who had been the victims of scams, a charity Maria had once told me about. I sealed it in an envelope and dropped it in the mail on my next trip into town. The act felt like setting down a heavy, invisible weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I never did recover the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor. It was lost, another casualty of the war. But one afternoon, While sorting through an old box of my son David's things that had been in storage, I found something I had forgotten existed. It was a small black and white snapshot, taken with a cheap camera in the early days of our marriage. It was a picture of Eleanor on a windswept beach much like this one, her hair a chaotic halo around her head, laughing, her face turned not to the camera, but to me. It was not the formal posed portrait that had sat by my bed for 40 years. It was her essence, a captured moment of pure, unscripted joy. I spent a week in my workshop building a simple, elegant frame for it from a piece of weathered oak I had found on the shore. It now sits on my mantelpiece, the only photograph in the entire cottage. It is enough. My isolation is no longer absolute. I exchange postcards every few months with Maria. She sends pictures of her growing family. I send her pictures of the dramatic, rocky coastline. We never write about the past. Our correspondence is a quiet acknowledgement that a bond was forged in that dark time. A bond of shared purpose that does not need to be spoken of. Her postcards are a welcome reminder that the world still contains simple, decent people, a fact that is sometimes easy to forget. Tonight, my final task is complete. For the past year, I have been writing. I have been filling the pages of my last clean financial ledger, not with numbers, but with words. I have been conducting a final audit, not of an account, but of a life. I have written down the entire story, from the first deceptive phone call to the final, quiet emptiness of the aftermath. The book is full. The story is told. I take the heavy ledger and a box of matches and walk out into the cool, salt-tinged night. Down on the beach, I build a small, neat pyre of driftwood. I open the ledger one last time and look at my own, neat, block-printed handwriting, the methodical record of my own descent and rebirth. Then I place the book on the pyre. I strike a match. The flame sputters in the sea breeze, then catches. The pages curl, turning black at the edges, the ink of my story dissolving into the heat and the light. I am not destroying the memory. I am releasing myself from the burden of being its sole keeper. The story no longer belongs to me. It belongs to the flames, to the wind, to the vast, indifferent ocean. I watch until the last page has turned to ash, until the last ember has winked out into the darkness. I stand up and look out at the dark water, where the lights of a distant fishing boat mark the horizon. I am an old man, alone on a dark beach. I have lost my family, my home, my past. But I have reclaimed myself. I breathe in the cold, clean air of the sea. I am finally and completely free.